Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you for those who have been for the first lecture and have been so well behaved and are ready for the next one. So the next speaker is the best archivist in the whole wide world, our own, very own Frieda Midgley, who is the person who put the timeline on the corridor so that Jeremy mentioned. That was done for our 150th anniversary, and it has remained there because A, it's a fantastic piece of work, very useful, and also it explains exactly how this college came to be. And there is, as Frieda will show you, that is what Old Hall looked like right at the beginning, and I think that's quite extraordinary. When you, at the end of the day, when the Lego workshops are over, they will have built a Lego version of that. So that's something to look forward to. So with no further ado, because I know that you've got the bio of Frieda in your booklet, so do refer to that. But I would like Frieda to begin her wonderful history of Newnham and all that sails in her. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and thank you all for coming. It's lovely to see quite so many of you here. So yes, I'm college archivist here at Newnham, and Sarah's given me a glowing introduction, but I should give a lot of credit to all my predecessors as well, who've done a fantastic job in getting the archive to the point that it currently is. I've been college archivist here for just over 4 years, and as the name suggests, I look after a collection that consists of both the formal records of the college, but also records of student clubs and societies, various collections of personal papers from fellows and alumni, and as you'll see, quite a lot of photographic material going back to the very beginnings of the college. So the development of the college buildings and the thinking behind it is reasonably well documented in those collections. Today we're marking the 150th anniversary of the very first building on this site, as Sarah said, and here is Newnham Hall, as it was originally known. I'm going to talk about how the site has developed from that point and why. And again, as Sarah alluded to, this is something that's come out of the Timeline project, which actually was the idea of our curator, Laura Dennis, who's here in the audience somewhere. And so, credit to her for that as well. When we put that idea forward for the 150th anniversary, we thought it was an interesting topic in and of itself, but also a way to preserve the memory of some of the buildings that Newnham has known and mostly loved. We've heard some opinions about Strachey already this morning. And that have made way for new development as the needs of the college have evolved. And indeed, a mechanism for people to reflect as they consider what might come next. So as many of you know already, Newnham College emerged from a scheme to open up higher education to women by providing a series of lectures for women in Cambridge, given by Cambridge academics. And this was popular enough that women wanted to travel from further afield to attend the whole course. So for the autumn of 1871, Henry Sidgwick rented a house in Regent Street as a residence for 5 students, presided over by Anne Jemima Clough, our first principal. The numbers grew, and for the following couple of years, they occupied Merton Hall, which is in the grounds of St John's College. The Batesons at St John's were a big supporter of the lectures for women and higher education for women. And indeed, St John's was a big supporter of Newnham through its early days. Meanwhile, plans were being formulated to build a permanent home. The Newnham Hall Company was formed as a financial vehicle, so rather than sort of a big donation, we were selling shares to a whole network of supporters of women's education. The site that you see Newnham Hall standing on was leased from St John's College for a period of 10 years in the first instance, on the understanding that it and the buildings would revert to St John's if the venture weren't successful. All the plans were negotiated with and approved by St John's, which in itself created a more substantial record than we might otherwise have had. And the architect engaged, of course, was one Basil Champneys, who was then at a fairly early stage in his career. The site and the area around it had been farmland, which is very much the sense you get from this image with the sheep in the front. And of course, it's slightly outside of the town centre at that time. It always makes me smile to think that when the university library was built on its current site, people were complaining that that was too far out of town. I have another image of the newly completed Newnham Hall, which gives a slightly different feel. Very much a new build and a very newly planted garden. And I think it gives more of a sense of the development that was taking place in this area of Cambridge at that time. You see in the background the neighbouring houses built along West Road, and similarly Grange Road was being developed, about to be developed. And it gives a very different feel about the way that that sort of former agricultural area was becoming a new suburb, essentially. So what were Anne Jemima Clough and her associates looking to create at Newnham Hall? In 1875, the year that it opened, she made the following observations in a talk for supporters in the north of England, starting with a very fundamental point. She said, "It's often asked, why should women leave home? Is not home education best for them? And these questions deserve a careful answer. A little reflection will, I think, show how much more effectually and with how much less mental strain a woman can study where all the arrangements of the house are made to suit the hours of study, where she can have undisturbed possession of one room, and where she can have access to any books that she may need. How rarely, if ever, these advantages can be secured in any home, we all know. And it is surely worth some sacrifice on the part of parents to obtain them for their daughters at the age when they are best fitted to profit by them to the utmost." So essentially, a room of one's own over 50 years before Virginia Woolf came to Newnham. It's also worth thinking what the first students had experienced at Regent Street. The journalist and alumna Mary Agnes Hamilton described the Regent Street house in her 1936 history of the college. The back faced onto Parker's Piece, which was as noisy almost as the street in front. Dark and dingy, the house was also too small. They dined at one table, and at that same table they worked. There were no separate studies, and the bedrooms were too small and too cold to be used for that purpose. There was no garden and no games. Walks had to be taken and visits to friends paid under careful chaperonage, since all eyes were on the students and their behaviour. So, what facilities were planned for Newnham Hall? Champneys had suggested that a women's college should be of a more domestic character in order to feel welcoming. And what do we see? This is one of the Champneys plans of what became Newnham Hall. You'll notice it says Merton Hall at the top, which is where the college was based at the point that they were beginning to develop these plans. I should also say the plans were in a bit of a state. My predecessor had them conserved. They are now mounted on lovely conservation board and encapsulated in Melinex and in a much happier state than they were. So we see here, this is the first floor of Old Hall as we know it now. They've managed to squeeze 13 study bedrooms in, 1 bathroom, 3 loos. They are individual study bedrooms, not sets as you get at some colleges. So quite basic, but it gives people their individual space. If we look at the ground floor here, you can see that you've got the common spaces. There are lecture rooms, there's a dining room, and you can see where someone's sketched on the bays that were added to the dining room later. It's a plan that has had a life. There's accommodation for the principal on the far right there, 2 rooms. You've got service facilities in the wing at the bottom, and sort of front stairs and back stairs, very much like a large house. So it's fairly modest, but it meets the objectives. And it's also providing peace and quiet, and importantly, privacy, when you think about that point about the scrutiny that the women felt they were under. And a student called Margaret Merrifield, who later became Margaret Verrill, who was at Newnham in 1875, wrote home to her mother, "You talk about enjoying the country. It's just like the country here. We're completely private in our garden and quite surrounded with country sights and sounds. Cows and sheep in the fields round us, and birds of all sorts just outside the hedge. The lawn tennis has come, and I've played several games." So there's Newnham Hall. Newnham Hall opened in 1875, but that was very much just the start. By 1878, we've got a laboratory on site and a gym next door to the hall. And in 1880, a second hall is completed, which provided more student accommodation, obviously, 3 more lecture rooms, and space for the then vice principal, Ellen Sidgwick, and her husband Henry to live on site. Once this was constructed, it became known as North Hall, with Newnham Hall becoming known as South Hall, but of course we all know it as Sidgwick Hall. And this picture is one of my favourites for teasing people, because you ask them to identify it, and they're sort of thinking, well, it looks like Sidgwick, but what's the road doing there? This is the garden side of Sidgwick, with railings, with a post box, with a lamp post, and it is because the road at that point, Newnham Walk, had been extended to provide access to this building, and the road divided the two halls. During the daytime, the gates were open and you could pass between them, but in the evening the gates were locked and you essentially had two halls with quite a separate existence. The college went on to acquire further pieces of land, two further fields to the western side of our current site from St John's, extending it right the way up to Grange Road, and making it possible to continue the development of the Champneys buildings, with Clough Hall here, opening in 1888. One of the attractions of this building was that the student rooms were slightly larger than they had been in the previous building, so they're more suited to socialising. And another attraction is the big dining hall that we know and love, which was much larger than the dining rooms in the other two halls, and had a new kitchen that supplied both Clough and Sidgwick. And in what would become a very distinctive feature of Newnham, Clough Hall was connected to Sidgwick Hall by a corridor. And here, this is the Ordnance Survey map from 1888. It was surveyed in 1886, where you see North Hall marked to the north there, South Hall marked to the south, and the road continuing right up between the sections of the garden as it is now, with space for Clough Hall to be developed. Leaving a big barrier to creating a coherent site. The plan was formulated to create a new road to the north of the site. So what you see on the plan there is just a footpath running along what is now Sidgwick Avenue. The main access to the college in the early days was via sort of up from the mill pond, via that little lane, which caused all sorts of logistical problems. Blanche Athena Clough has a very entertaining account of, carts and cabs trying to get up and down it at the start and end of term. But it wasn't just a necessity for the college that Sidgwick Avenue should be built. As I've mentioned, houses were being developed all along Grange Road, and it was actually essential to the wider development of this area of Cambridge. It was something that turned out to be a longer and much more complicated process than anyone had hoped, but eventually Sidgwick Avenue opened in 1891, and at that point we could close the right-of-way through the centre of the college, develop the gardens, and the college became one. And that's perhaps exemplified by the construction of the Pfeiffer building, giving us a proper entranceway and linking Old Hall to Sidgwick Hall physically. Pfeiffer building had a corridor with lecture rooms off it that joined in a dogleg onto Sidgwick Hall. So you now had a connected series of halls. It was also feasible to create a central library facility. And the Yates Thompson Library opened in 1897. Within a decade, it was already growing out of its space, and so it was extended in 1907. And as well as continuing increasing its student numbers, Newnham was steadily increasing the size of its academic staff. And the early years of the 20th century also saw the rise of postgraduate research. So in 1906, we have the Kennedy Building, which was designed for fellows and research students, providing suites of 2 rooms with lots of space for books and indeed for entertaining visitors. And then the final building in the Champneys scheme, Peel, came along in 1910. And Champneys himself observed that had the benefit of enclosing the site and blocking out the Grange Road houses. I don't think he was just being snobbish about the new developments. I think it brings us back to the importance of a sense of privacy within the site, of not being overlooked and scrutinised. And it might sound trivial, but even small freedoms like the fact that the women weren't required to wear hats within the grounds are actually quite significant to creating a place where they feel at liberty and where they feel at home. So you have the arrangement that we're familiar with now, the sort of E shape of halls running round, and the arrangement of the halls shaped the interactions and the identity of the college community. In the early days, they functioned very similarly to a sort of house system in schools, I guess. They provide pastoral care. You had academics living in and overseeing the running of the domestic arrangements in each hall. They all had their own domestic arrangements. The students ate in their own halls, and they played inter-hall sports, and they even had competitive fire drills between the individual student fire brigades. So yes, that takes us up to the First World War, which, perhaps not surprisingly, put a hold on the physical development of the college for a time. And it's the 1930s before you get the next big development. This time, the architect is a woman, Elizabeth Scott, of the Gilbert Scott dynasty, and one of the first women to train at the Architectural Association. And I think this may have been a very deliberate choice. It was a time when Newnham was encouraging its students into a wide range of professions that were opening up to women. Alumna Ray Strachey had set up the Cambridge Women's Appointments Board, and the college had stated its intent, for example, to replace the retiring head gardener with a woman who had trained at a horticultural college. So I think they're deliberately setting an example here. When I originally developed the timeline, I did a bit of a disservice to Elizabeth Scott because I hadn't fully appreciated the context of the Fawcett building. So it was, yes, 1938 Fawcett, but actually what she's developed is an entire scheme for redeveloping the eastern end of the college. And if we look at the plan here that was included in the fundraising booklet, what she's created is, yes, the accommodation along the Strachey side, but then running down, she has a big assembly hall. She has lecture rooms. She has even things like the hospital wing is being redeveloped. There's bicycle storage. It's quite a significant development, and it won't be lost on you that it looks not dissimilar to what we have today. Yeah. The college still has its back to Sidgwick Avenue, but I noticed that the age of the car has arrived. There's a big car park planned in there. And you can see from the costings on the right that the scheme was costed in sections so that it could be realised in stages as funds became available. There was a big fundraising drive backed by Queen Mary, and it was this campaign that gave rise to the Friends of Newnham. They got up to half the target amount fairly swiftly. So the Fawcett building was opened in 1938. And here we see the new Fawcett building and the demolition in progress of the lecture room corridor that I described, which had joined the Pfeiffer building onto Sidgwick Hall. So what went wrong? How was it that we didn't end up with the full Scott scheme? The obvious thing that came along and disrupted things, as it's wont to do, is World War II. The college was making preparations for that very soon after Fawcett was completed. And of course, after the war, the landscape had shifted in lots of ways. The academic year 1945-46 saw a record number of students at Newnham. Many people whose studies had been interrupted by World War II were coming back to complete them. And graduate numbers increased threefold by 1947-48 academic year. So it was at this point that the college acquired the Pytel, the big 19th century house just on Newnham Walk, and Whitstead, the early 20th century arts and crafts style house on the Barton Road side of the sports field. But also the college was now working with Buckland and Hayward, pushed on with the redevelopment of the wings of the Pfeiffer building, which had been part of the Scott plan, to give a lot more student accommodation. But also they created a new Porter's Lodge, which was not something that had been part of the Scott site plan, but as Principal Myra Curtis observed, she said, "This is a peculiarly fitting time for the college to present its main entrance to Sidgwick Avenue, since the land on the opposite side of the street is about to be developed by the University for the Arts faculties, our approach to which will thus be more immediate than any other college." She goes on to outline that the plan to take a break after they've finished the redevelopment of Pfeiffer, but it's still her intention to carry on with the Scott plan at that point. And she talks about the fact that there will be a new range at right angles to Fawcett and joined to Pfeiffer by a one-storey passage, although the funds were not available at present. But something that was funded, because of a legacy that had just come through, was a new Principal's Lodge in memory of alumna Muriel Lloyd. Here is Louis Osmond's sketch of the facade there. So until this point, the principal had been living in accommodation within various of the halls, most recently in a flat above the Pfeiffer Archway. Lloyd Lodge, which was completed in 1958, gave not only a private residence, but also rooms adequate for entertaining on a scale suitable for the head of a college. So again, you see a shift in what was thought, the functions and what was thought appropriate. It's on a courtyard plan, which is perfectly square, and all the heights throughout the building are geometrically related to the dimensions of that plan. And the interior courtyard famously contained the tallest plate glass windows in the world when it was built, which proved hugely impractical in a number of ways. Of the material I have in the archive on Lloyd Lodge, there are a disproportionate number of files that are all about troubleshooting to do with the windows and the heating system. And ultimately, in 1993, the courtyard was enclosed, and it's produced a much more workable space. By the early 60s, the focus had swung back to student accommodation again, and in the 1964 roll letter, the present student's letter is reporting that a certain number of second and third year students are being asked in response to the Robbins report, which had of course recommended the immediate expansion of university provision across the country. So students were being asked to volunteer to move out of college into digs so that Newnham can accept more freshmen this autumn and get ahead of the bulge to be expected next year. She goes on to observe that a few people would prefer to live out anyway, but others are afraid for the collegiate system, which I think was a very legitimate fear, because you're sort of disbanding this close network of halls that had sort of seen Newnham through to this point. But it gave rise to the famous Strachey building, which if you're here in the last session, you'll already have heard a bit about. Principal Ruth Cohen at the opening of Strachey explained that it had been the intention to increase student numbers anyway, and to build accommodation for this, but they hadn't necessarily anticipated doing it until the 100th anniversary of the college in 1971. Robbins had forced the issue, and here we have Strachey. And Christophe Brier, the architect, describes how he'd designed flexibility into Strachey. He was looking to allow the possibility of combining the rooms in a very flexible way. He'd arranged them in pairs so that, if there's an increase in the number of graduates requiring a 2-room set, that can be accommodated. There's the possibility of adapting them to house married students or students of both sexes in the distant future. And you've got the pattern that we now recognise of study bedrooms grouped as flats with shared kitchens and bathrooms. But he concludes by saying that the college and the architect have had to forecast the needs of users for many years to come, and only time will tell how well they have succeeded. Now, some of you know what happens next. The rest of you hold on to that, because we'll come back to it. This is a lovely plan, actually from the later site plan from Allids and Morrison when they were designing the Rosalind Franklin building. But it shows you the floor footprint of Strachey and how it fitted into the site. By the early 1980s, the first of the Champneys buildings had reached or were approaching their centenary, and there was a survey that revealed some significant issues with deteriorating brickwork, consequent damp, damage to roof timbers, and in one of the halls, dry rot, which needed urgent action. So a £1 million appeal was launched, and work got moving as quick as possible. These photos are all of the work that was done to Old Hall. You can see that the gable ends and the chimneys were completely rebuilt, and you've got exact replicas of the urns and finials to replace the ones that had deteriorated. There's also an effect on the wider college site, because part of the way that this was funded was by selling off certain parcels of land, notably the area that is now Champneys Walk, appropriately enough. Fast forwarding to the 1990s, the college is now anticipating an increase in postgraduate numbers, which is being driven by the university's focus on research. And this leads to the development of the Rosalind Franklin building, which opened in 1995. reflecting the maturity and independence of the postgraduate students that they're designing for, it was created as 5 houses, each with 2 one-bedroom flats on the ground floor, and then above that 8 study bedrooms with shared kitchen, laundry, bathroom facilities above. Significantly for the time, each study bedroom boasted a connection to the university-wide fibre optic computer cable. So we really are getting with the times. For the first quarter of this century, which it still pains me to describe in that way, the focus has been largely on the Sidgwick Avenue frontage and the buildings along there. And unfortunately for Christophe Grier, time did tell. The 3 major 21st century developments, the library, the buttery, and the Dorothy Garrett building, have all superseded all 3 of his buildings that were on this site. And as we learned from the end of the last section, that's a pattern that has been repeating itself across Cambridge, unfortunately. This is the Horner Library, 1962 Horner Library, sitting at the Sidgwick Avenue side of Sidgwick Hall. You can see the apse of the Yates-Thompson Library on the left there, and the Catherine Stephen Rare Books room, stripes just peeping through on the right. By the early 2000s, the fabric of this building was beginning to deteriorate, and we were finding that it couldn't be expanded or adapted to solve issues with environmental control and storage capacity, floor loadings for book stacks, this kind of thing. The Catherine Stephen room had been built in 1982 to give us specialist storage for rare books, but ultimately the decision was made to replace the 1960s library and fully utilize the space between the original Yates-Thompson Library and the Catherine Stephen room. And yes, you see the effect on Sidgwick Avenue, the run of buildings that we recognize now, and the Catherine Stephen room are there at the end. This cut-through plan I like because it shows the difference in volume between the 2 sections of the original Yates-Thompson Library on the left there, and then the current Horner Markwick Library, which happily includes specialist provision for the archive. In the early 1970s, the college had decided to centralise dining arrangements in one location rather than in each hall, partly to reinforce the idea of the college as a corporate body. They also wanted to provide a cafeteria service and modernise the kitchens. So it was at that point that the first buttery was built. This was redeveloped in 2007, not just to provide upgraded facilities, but to provide a much more open approach to College Hall and additional function space. So that was the second of the Grier buildings that went by the way. Third one, by the 2010s, the Strachey building was presenting some serious issues. The services such as electricity and water were deteriorating badly, but they were encased within the concrete of the structure, so they were very difficult to access. We were finding that the building couldn't be configured to put in ensuite rooms, which were becoming vital for the conference trade, which, like most colleges in Cambridge, helps us keep afloat financially. And it was looking difficult to create an energy efficient and sustainable building just through refurbishing Strachey. So it was decided to redevelop it completely, giving us the Dorothy Garrett building, which you'll have noticed, completes the facade along Sidgwick Avenue, gives us a wonderfully spacious porter's lodge, brings together all sorts of space for conferences today, teaching rooms, office space, accommodation above, the Iris Cafe as a central social hub. It references the Champneys buildings in a number of ways. The architects, Walters and Cohen, chose the handmade red brick, raw concrete, wood and bronze, inspired by the arts and crafts principle of truth to materials. We've got roof gardens that echo the rooftop areas that are no longer accessible on the older buildings. And they were deliberately creating long views over the college gardens, which remain Newnham's unifying feature. So that is my lightning speed journey through 150 years of pretty near constant redevelopment as the college and its needs have grown and evolved. I know there are lots of people in the audience who have lived experience of large parts of this process and will no doubt have some interesting things to share with us at the end. Who knows what the next 150 years will bring, but for now, the focus is sustainability. There's a planned refurbishment of Kennedy, which is going to act as a low carbon pilot scheme for the other Champneys buildings. So it'll be very interesting to see what comes out of that. But I am going to leave you with this image of a very new Newnham Hall. Thank you.